Our first keynote speaker is a consultant, a published researcher, a coach specialising in strategic volunteer development and supporting volunteer leaders. The session today will look at advancing volunteering in complex organisational systems. And one of my favourite titles I've had for any of the speeches we've had at one of our conferences, Look What You Made Me Do. I think which this session speaks to me and is what's at the heart of today's event. And if I can lay down a challenge to all you guys that are on the call today, it's to take the opportunity to reflect on that question and ask what you're asking of your volunteers, and is it the right thing you're asking from them? Moving swiftly on, please welcome Dr. Helen Timbrell.
Hello, it is lovely to be with you. Obviously, if there is an opportunity to get a Taylor Swift title into a conference session, I will take that opportunity. It risks, I think. I'm assuming I can drive these slides. Can I, Chris? Or are you doing that at your end?
I think you might have to drive your own, Helen, because I don't know if we've got them in the main deck. I do apologise.
No worries. All sorted? I think we're sorted.
I think you're sorted, yes.
Okay. All right. So, look what made you do. Which risks, right? Sounding really dull, because I'm going to talk about complex organisational systems, which risks sounding dull, but I'm hoping to prove that it isn't the case. And I guess what I'm interested in is how we can hold looking at organisations as the whole in our head rather than just thinking about what's going on in volunteering. And I'll say a bit more about that as we go along. But I thought it might be useful to introduce myself a bit more. Some of you, I can see names I recognise, and also in a lovely way, lots that I don't in the chat already. So now I work as a consultant, and I work as a researcher, and I work as a coach. And almost all of my work is in charities, and particularly in charities that involve volunteers. My work kind of straddles people and organisational development. A lot of that work is around supporting organisations with volunteering strategy, their broader people strategies, thinking with organisations about the structures that they have in place to support the development of volunteering. So for me, organisational development is about organisation systems, structures, processes, and how they work well so people, whether they are staff or volunteers, can do their best work. My research background is also in volunteering, so I've just finished a year-long piece of work with Citizens Advice, helping them explore volunteer experiences and the value of volunteering in economic and non-economic terms. Some of you might have seen that work that we kind of published with them at the start of the summer. And I'm involved with a research project with 2 universities at the moment, exploring the experiences of social care-based volunteering, so volunteering in care homes in South Wales. My PhD was about volunteering, and it was supported by what was then Volunteer Development Scotland, is now Volunteer Scotland. So I kind of straddle a consultant experience in the world of people and volunteering, and research experience, but practitioner experience, having been the director of volunteering or the director of people in a number of national charities, the Samaritans, Versus Arthritis, and I spent over a decade as director of volunteering at the National Trust. The coaching work I do now often involves supporting people who are leading people teams, and commonly that includes people who are in heads of volunteering or equivalent roles. I think crucially, for all of my work and for today, I also make sure I continue to volunteer myself. I do that because volunteering is a value of mine. I think volunteering is a good thing, and it makes me happy to do it, but I also think it makes me better at the work I do to continue to experience volunteering kind of from that end of the perspective, if you like. So I'm a trustee for Dogs for Good. I'm a retail volunteer at my National Trust property that's closest to me. And I sit on the grant giving body, one of the grant giving bodies for the conservation volunteers, where we allocate community grants to really small kind of community-led local green spaces. So I kind of come today with all of that experience, researcher, practitioner, leader, but actually also a volunteer myself. And I loved that I saw Hayley's name in the chat, because Hayley, I was a very happy volunteer at Bath Cats and Dogs Home while I was doing my PhD. So even when I was researching for my PhD, I was actively volunteering at Bath Cats and Dogs Home. So it was nice to see your name today. So that's kind of the background to me, but there's also something I think about sharing beliefs I hold about volunteering, because there's a sort of where do you come from in your heart. So for me, where I come from in my heart is that when volunteering is done well, it absolutely changes organisations and communities and lives for the better. I also think volunteers can do anything. I don't mean they should do everything, but I think they can do anything. I don't think being paid is what distinguishes what you can or cannot do as a human being. I believe very strongly that managing volunteers is not the same as managing staff, and I know from experience that it is harder. And I think it's possible to run really large-scale volunteering operations with huge success, but that to do that, to develop volunteering in any organisation, requires kind of some attributes around curiosity, around humility and honesty, and a real willingness and ability to work in partnership. And that theme of partnership is one of the things I will talk about today. For me, what I believe and what I experience is that volunteering is a source of joy. It can be an enormous positive force and a source of joy, but it's also really...
Very, very quickly, just your slides. We're only getting your PowerPoint, your first slide still. Just...
I've moved on hugely.
I know you have. I can see you on that joy slide, which is what made me think that maybe we were looking at the wrong screen. And I think we're on the joy slide. Would I be right, Helen?
Yeah, so we're not yawning. Here's some places I've worked. Here's some things I believe. Volunteering's joyful.
There we go.
Place to come back. Volunteering's joyful, right. But it's really hard work, right? That joy isn't automatic. It's really hard work. And so let's move on. Let's look at Taylor. I think she's next. So here she comes. So clearly, part of my inspiration for today was Taylor Swift, not because I was just thinking about which Taylor Swift lyric could I use, but because it feels like it's been a year of Taylor Swift. I think she must be exhausted. It feels like she's been on the longest tour in the world ever. And in lots of ways, that also made me think about being a volunteer manager and how that joy isn't automatic. So I think there are lots of things about Taylor Swift's tour which are like being a volunteer manager. So she just keeps coming out, right? It's relentless. It's night after night. She just keeps coming out and giving it her all. And in a way, whoever her audience is that evening doesn't care what she did the day before or the week before, or when she was in Europe, or when she was in the States, or wherever she was. And I think that is like a volunteer manager. You have to just keep fronting up. You have to keep delivering for whoever is in front of you that day. There is a relentlessness, I think, about being a volunteer manager sometimes, which is part of what's hard. I also think it's very exposing. She's a solo artist, and I've not been to see her, but I went to see the film, and I don't know whether some of you will have done both of those two things, right? But I had a real sense when I watched that film of the enormous stages on which she stands, and she is often all by herself. So the band or the dancers might not be out, and there is a kind of huge sense of expectation focused on her as an individual, which I also think and have lived is very similar to being a volunteer manager. You might not be doing it all by yourself. You might have lots of other things going on in the background and people supporting you, but it can feel like there are these enormous expectations on us as volunteer managers. On a really practical note, she's out in all weathers. We've all done that as volunteer managers, right? We've seen those pictures of her out in the rain. That's what it's like when we've been managing other people as a volunteer, or we've been volunteering ourselves, whether we've been car parking at events or park run volunteering. You carry on regardless is a very volunteer management trait, I think. I think she's also really brilliant at building community, right? That sense of sharing and giving, whether it's bracelets or kind of just the spirit of being in a community of supporters, I think is a thing that volunteer managers, when they do things well, are really good at doing. And she's really good at thanking her supporters, right? She's really good at acknowledging the contribution they've made. Even when she's working really hard herself, she thanks the people who have supported her, and she thanks the team who are around her. And I think that's what we do as good volunteer managers. But right, she's also got loads of detractors. So people who talk about the fact that she's singing the wrong songs, or she's wearing the wrong outfit, or she's got the wrong boyfriend, or she's too political, or she's not political enough. And in my view, often those detractors are not really driven by what she's wearing or what she's singing. What they criticize or complain about is not necessarily those specific things. It's probably about railing against a woman being really successful, a woman choosing not to get married, a woman choosing not to have children, a woman choosing to have so many cats, a woman daring to be visible and confident and intelligent and to have views and to express them. And so when they articulate their complaint, I don't think often that's the source of the complaint, which is kind of like what I want to talk about today, that the problems colleagues raise about volunteering, or the things they say about volunteering and maybe look to us as volunteer managers to solve, aren't really about volunteering, in the same way that when people complain about what Taylor Swift's wearing or how many cats she's got, it's not really what's getting to them. And yet, despite the fact that the problems that are raised in Australia, sorry, I'm reading the comments, the problems that are raised in volunteering are not really about volunteering, I think we can find ourselves feeling like we have to solve them. We take on those expectations of others, or that sense of responsibility for solving problems which are outside of our direct control and influence. And so whether it's well-intentioned or not, I would argue that it's unhelpful, the way in which we take on those additional responsibilities. So there is for me this kind of question of what is it our organisations made us do as volunteer managers. So let's move on. So I guess what I'm particularly interested in is these two things today. My feeling is that the problems, in inverted commas, that show up, my language, in volunteering are often not about volunteering or caused by volunteering. However, as leaders of volunteers, we're often asked to solve those problems. So a couple of examples I was thinking about. So what does it, so if people kind of go, you've lost me, Helen, not really resonating. I was trying to think of live examples. So live example, last week I was with a client who were looking to, a set of directors and heads in an organisation looking to grow and develop the scale of and breadth of volunteering in their organisation. And what they were discussing was lots and lots of senior staff were very concerned that if loads more volunteers joined the organisation, staff would start to feel undervalued, and staff would start to feel like their professional identity and their value as a profession would be lessened. Now, that's not about volunteering. That's about an organisational culture around staff recognition and engagement. So volunteer leaders and managers can't solve that problem alone. So for me, that's an example of a problem that shows up and is articulated as about volunteering or about to be caused by volunteering, but is about something much bigger. The other, I think, really easy example to go to is when, as leaders and managers of volunteers, we are asked to diversify our volunteer base. It is a problem for us as volunteer managers and leaders that our volunteer workforce, in inverted commas, is not diverse. Now, lack of diversity in a volunteer team or a volunteer body or workforce, whatever language you're comfortable with, is not about volunteering alone. It will be about organisational commitment and understanding to EDI in the broadest sense. It will be what strategy the organisation has put around EDI. It will be around the resources. It will be about staff diversity. It will be about where you're operating in the country. And so for me, again, that feels like a good example where lack of diversity in volunteering is the problem that shows up that volunteer leaders and managers are asked to solve, but they cannot possibly solve that by themselves. Couple of other examples. A client that I worked with earlier this year had recently integrated their HR and volunteering teams, and what was happening as a result was people across the organisation who were looking for advice and guidance about volunteering were often not getting it because it was falling between the cracks of different teams, or there was inconsistency in the answers that different teams were getting. Now, that's not about volunteering. That was held up as a problem in volunteering, the poor quality of advice, but that was about siloed working in that organisation and in that people directorate that volunteering leaders alone weren't in a position to solve. If you are often told that volunteers don't deliver to the right standard, or volunteers are a problem, or volunteers need their performance managing, but that isn't happening, that may well not be happening because there is an organisational culture of not tackling poor performance, full stop, in staff or volunteers. And so if there isn't a culture of supporting good performance or managing poor performance across the organisation, why on earth would you expect there to be one in volunteering? So again, volunteering leaders can't solve that problem alone. It is a more systemic cultural problem in the organisation. And so hopefully this is giving you a sense of the sorts of examples I was thinking of where I feel like as leaders and managers of volunteers, as volunteering team leaders, we have disproportionately high expectations placed upon us. Big asks are made of us, often with lower levels of resource, often with smaller teams than other parts of the organisation. So we're asked to solve really big problems with really small amounts of resource. And often we take that on. We take that on because why? Because we're grateful for the attention. We're grateful that finally someone's noticed volunteering and is having a conversation with us. Or because we think if we do this right, it will just unlock more resource for us. Because we're people who genuinely want to do good in our organisations. I don't know, all sorts of reasons why we take it on. But I think it really matters, and I think it really matters for 3 reasons. Let's have the next slide, Chris. So there's 3 reasons why I think it really matters. One is our own health and well-being, frankly, and a limit to what we take on, either kind of literally in kind of actual workload or mentally in terms of the kind of mental workload we find ourselves or feel ourselves to be responsible for. For me, there are limits to what we could and should take full responsibility for as leaders of volunteers. So I felt in the years that I was the director of volunteering at the National Trust, which is some time ago now, but I can still really feel the pressure I felt around visitor experience, because what I was being told in the organisation by lots of very senior leaders at that time was having lots of older white women deliver the visitor experience is part of the problem. Our visitor experience is poor because of who our volunteers are. And I felt an enormous responsibility to kind of solve that, when clearly the quality of visitor experience across the National Trust is not solely my responsibility as a volunteering leader to resolve or to tackle. And I'm not sure I was ever being specifically told it was my direct responsibility, but the messages I was getting, I was turning into this sense of responsibility. So it matters for our health and well-being. I also think it matters for where we spend our time. So sometimes I think we risk getting bumped into answering the wrong, in inverted commas, question. This sense of kind of almost being diverted from the bigger picture strategic issues to tactical ones, or not getting the time to spend on the things that would really make sustainable change, and being diverted to stuff that's kind of really visible or, as I say, tactical. So there is something for me about us being thoughtful about where we spend our time. And then I think it really matters because for me, this is about how we develop and think about the skills and attributes and knowledge that we might need to be effective leaders and managers of volunteers. So I think that sense of limiting what we take on, or recognising the limits of what we are able to do or should be able to do, feels really important. So next slide, Chris. This is always a classic, which I think it is useful to remind ourselves of. Many of you will be familiar with this model if you've never seen it before, fear not. So this difference between what's in our control, we're able to influence, and what's of concern for us. And so there is often encouragement to focus on what you can control, what you can directly control or impact through thoughts, words, or actions. And I guess what I'm interested in is that circle of influence, the concerns we can do something about. So we're recognizing that we don't have control over that outcome, but working on how we can influence it. And so for me, part of how we get better at influencing is by taking a more organisational development perspective to the work that we do, and maybe thinking of ourselves less as volunteer leaders and managers and more as organisational development practitioners or specialists. So what does this mean? Next one, Chris. You're being a very good glamorous assistant. Thank you very much. So there are loads of like very theoretical and sometimes, quite frankly, a bit overly academic definitions of what organisational development is. It's a professional field. Some of you will know this and be familiar with it, but for those who don't, I quite like the CIPD definition because it talks about organisational development, uses a systematic approach to drive performance. So it's about how we think about things in the round in order to make organisations better. It looks at things like culture, capability, values, and relationships. It takes this ecosystems approach to understanding and then thinking about how that influences behaviour and performance. So the key things for me is it's a planned approach, it's systemic, so it's looking organisation-wide, and it's focused on how to make things better. So in really practical terms, next one, Chris, in my like very basic Helen Timbrell straightforward language, less microscope, more telescope. So sometimes I think that what we do in volunteering is get too stuck in being down in the detail and knowing our own kind of professional practice inside out. We obsess about the detail of what's happening in volunteering. We get a bit microscopic about it. And for me, there is a huge opportunity and need to get a bit more telescope about it, a kind of heads up and out. So for me, that question is often about thinking less about what's going on in volunteering and what am I trying to do there, or how am I trying to influence change, but more about how is the organisational system in which we're operating impacting volunteering. And if I think about it that way and ask the question that way, I often get to different types of work. So I really come across leaders and managers in volunteering quite often in my work now who are just in a granular level of detail that I think is unhelpful when they are trying to influence change in their organisation. So I will see leaders and managers of volunteering with good intent sharing such granular detail on what's happening in volunteering with their senior leaders in a bid to try and gain support, access resources, and they lose their audience in that because they are too microscopic and not telescopic, if that word, enough. So it also, what it does is doesn't give the problem back to those people. It doesn't make the problem the organisational problem it really is, and it reinforces that sense as volunteering leaders we can solve this by ourselves. So next slide, Chris. It's a bit like this: less planet, more galaxy. So that sense of thinking about the whole organisation, that question of how is the organisational system we're operating in impacting volunteering, being a very different question from what's happening in volunteering and what do I need to do about it. Because if you start with what's the organisational system we're operating in, you immediately and automatically go to how do all of us as leaders and managers in this organisational system solve these volunteering dilemmas together, rather than if I start with describing what's happening in volunteering, I get to what do I have to do about it as the leader and manager of volunteering. Okay, next one. I'm nearly done. Oh, here we go. Here's some models. I love a model. I think there should be a prize for bringing these 3 models and Taylor Swift into the same presentation and arguing that there is a relationship between these 3 things, right? So in organisational development, we would talk about diagnostic tools. That's the language we would use. We would talk about how do we kind of approach understanding the organisational system that we're in. And there are different models of doing it. These are 3 ways that are commonly used in the world of organisational development. And I'm not going to go into the detail of each of these, but and you can find them online and read more about them. But there is this sense for me of taking that systemic view. What is going on in the organisation as a whole? So if we look at the next slide, the one I probably use the most is this one. And I would say, so I did a piece of work for a national charity earlier this year, where they had asked, the ask was to look at how they'd structured resources for volunteering and to help them think about a new volunteer journey. And I could have done that. I could have started in what's going on in volunteering and what do we do about it. But actually what I did was take this approach to think about what's the organisational system in which volunteering is taking place and in which they want to locate a volunteer journey. And so worked around each of these things. So I'm mindful that there's 3 models, there's one in a bit of detail, all of them are really complex and detailed. So I can happily talk to folk outside of this session if you want to know more about this. But critically for me is the interrelationships here. So another good example of how I sometimes see things happening in volunteer involving organisations is around systems, right? And this feels particularly relevant given the kind of the event we're at. There's a lot of conversation around what is the volunteer system we need to put in place. And I would always be thinking about what is the organisational context, what is the organisational context in which any volunteering system needs to land and be embedded. So I would very rarely just want to think about the system. I would be thinking about all those things that make that volunteering system successful. So last couple of slides from me. Chris, thanks. There is something for me about if we don't take that systemic view, we often get bumped into or have this sense of obligation to find solutions. So we absorb a bit, we become like a sponge for organisational problems, or we take on this sense of having to solve it. And I guess what I think taking an organisational development perspective helps us do is be less of a sponge and more of a mirror. So less where we absorb it all ourselves and busy ourselves with having to solve it, and more having access to the insights, the data, the information that we can hold up as a mirror to our organisations, and crucially invite other people in to solve things with us. So we take less of it on ourselves, not in a slopey shouldered kind of, you know, dismissive fashion, but more in a reflecting back to the organisation. This is what's going on, and this is how we need to work in partnership to take volunteering forward. So less sponge, more mirror. And if we do that, Chris, the next one, thank you very much, is we spend more time understanding the problem, and we get a bit more critical of the problem that might have been given to us. So when we're asked to solve diversity in volunteering, or we're asked to solve poor performance in volunteering, or we're asked to solve why the volunteering team is giving different answers to different teams and there's inconsistency in services, or we're asked to solve any of these things, we spend more time really thinking about what's the organisational context in which this thing is occurring. And we do less description of what we find and more analysis. So I often see volunteer managers and leaders spend a lot of time trying to share with their more senior colleagues very detailed descriptions of what's happening, with much less analysis of what that really means for the organisation. So doing all of that before we get to a sense of feeling like we have to come up with the solution. And those solutions, if we take a kind of organisation-wide perspective, will almost always be ones that mean we have to work in partnership. So last couple from me. Things you can do. You can do these really quickly if you want, Chris. So more telescope, less microscope, less planet, more galaxy. Absorb less, reflect more, so more mirror, less sponge. If you take away nothing else, take away microscopes, galaxies and mirrors. Those will be my 3 takeaways from today. But crucially, more understanding of the problem and avoiding just jumping to solutions. And so I think the thing on the left is what I'm saying, do more of. The thing on the right is around how we get there. So I think there is something about, as leaders and managers of volunteers, developing our knowledge and skills in how to do diagnostic work well, and developing the skills and confidence in analysis and presentation of findings at a strategic level. Stop describing in granular detail everything that's going on. And I still see leaders and managers of volunteering do that, and I understand where that comes from. And I do think there is something about considering investing in training or development around organisational development. All of this needs to be underpinned by seeking out and nurturing the internal partnerships that will help us be successful. So one more on this stuff. Chris, thanks. It's really easy, right, for someone who's worked in large organisations, particularly so in the National Trust, in Samaritans, even in Versus Arthritis, organisations that had relatively healthy budgets to support training and development. It's really easy to say something as simple as consider investing in training and development. And I know that there is a time cost and a financial cost, and that these are particularly challenging times in organisations. And I guess I just wanted to highlight there are so many ways in which one could begin a journey in learning more about organisational development that is not about the one on the left, a programme of study or qualifications. And at various times in my career, I have done all of those. Sometimes some of those, many of those all at the same time, but all of those have served me well in my own development in the world of OD and continue to do so. So I guess my encouragement is to think more around organisational development as a way to get into what is happening in volunteering in our organisations. And if we do that, I think, Chris, that where we get back to is we get more joy in our own work, in managing our own well-being, managing our own development, managing how we use our time, but also in terms of the joy that volunteering can bring for our organisations. Okay, I've got one more, which is 2 specific things that I'm going to shamelessly plug that may be of interest to you or your colleagues, and which are spaces in which we take an organisational development approach. So we have an event in the middle of November where we are particularly looking at where HR and volunteering teams come together and what makes a successful integration around that. It's particularly aimed at people who come perhaps more from an HR than a volunteering background, but it might be something that you want to look at or share with your colleagues. And then there is also a programme of action learning set for people who are heads of or kind of senior managers in charities. which is a program run by the Centre for Charity Effectiveness at Bayes Business School, where I facilitate that Action Learning Set program. I'm one of the consultants there and facilitate that Action Learning Set program. And we bring together heads from different charities to explore live issues through action learning. And we absolutely take an organisational development perspective in there. So hopefully not a yawn fest. I might have shoehorned in Taylor Swift quite dramatically, but my encouragement, if nothing else, is to think about how taking a more organisational development perspective can help us feel better in the work that we do, and also help us do better work and bring more joy as leaders and managers of volunteers. The last one of these slides has got my contact details on, I think, Chris, but happy to take questions and chat it through. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That was it was really interesting. I think how you managed to get Taylor Swift in as a metaphor for organisational development is, that in itself was worth listening to as part of the session. So well done on that front. There's a few sort of questions, a few things maybe to discuss and get your thoughts on that people have raised in the chat. I'll go with the last one just because I think it's an easy one to start with. Any podcasts or any sort of anything you might recommend for people to go and listen to? That was from Tony.
Is this because you want me to recommend your podcast, Chris? Is this
You're more than welcome to, but I'm not sure we're necessarily the right place for OB, but yeah, why not?
It's a really good question. It's hard even if you did like a simple Google search for like organisational development podcast, it's really hard to find anything that describes itself as that. But there are podcasts that I think are in this space sometimes. I'm wondering whether what might be helpful, because I'm also seeing the links for some of the courses, whether what I might do is, before you share these slides, Chris, I could add an extra one with put some links and resources in, rather than list it all off now. Shall I do that for like both podcasts and courses?
Yes, please. That'd be great. That'd be really, I think that'd be really helpful. It gives them a starting point, doesn't it? And then you can build from there. Jeff Nichols had a question where he was wondering what you think the difference between being a volunteer manager versus a manager of staff, what the skill differences might be, and why you think it's often more challenging to be a volunteer manager in maybe HR.
So the really simple thing I want to say is, because I've done both and I know, so like lived experience would be one of it, and then I guess the more perhaps more respectful and fulsome answer would be, so I really like the work that Anne-Marie Green and Jenna Ward did around this. So, and AVM have been a really good advocate of this work. So when I was at the National Trust, I commissioned work from academics who were then at Leicester to explore whether it was different, whether and if so how it was different managing staff and volunteers. And their work talks about the additional emotional labour that is involved in managing volunteers, because you are often without a written contract, so everything is in kind of psychological contract terms. Volunteers come with a different sense of identity to staff. You are often managing a complex interrelation between a volunteer being a volunteer, possibly also a beneficiary of the charity, possibly also a donor of the charity, possibly also a member of that charity. The number of hats that a volunteer can wear is often greater than the number of hats a member of staff can wear, and that brings, and all of those relationships have a different kind of set of expectations and contracts. So the complexity of the relationship a volunteer has with an organisation, I think, is greater, and there is this additional sense of kind of emotional labour. And if you've not come across that work, Ruth has put the link in the chat, which is really helpful, because there's a really great toolkit that AVM and the researchers then went on to put in place. So it took it beyond saying this is how managing volunteers is different, into, and this is what to do about that. I also think there's some real practical things about spans of control. So in good organisational development or organisational design terms, there would often be kind of really clear guidelines about the maximum number of staff a line manager would support. There's kind of core good practice around that. It is common in volunteering for leaders and managers of volunteers to have much larger teams. So I think the combination of every volunteer relationship may be more complex because that volunteer may be wearing multiple hats, alongside a greater size team, so more volunteers than you would have staff, come together to make the leadership and management of volunteering more complex. And then you layer over that the emotional labour. It's definitely harder, Jeff. It's definitely harder.
So it's basically less control and being asked to do more with more people. So
yeah, I mean, a good manager of staff would say they wouldn't rely on control either. But
no, I appreciate it. Very good. There's a couple of points that sort of I think allude to sort of the challenge you have as a volunteer manager in terms of power. And Jennifer has talked about it in terms of a heavily siloed organisation, and Rhiannon mentioned it in terms of the general pushback she gets from senior management. I think both of them points sort of allude to the fact that as a volunteer manager, you may not have the organisational power to necessarily influence as you would like some of the changes you would like to see. I don't know maybe how you address that and that sort of challenge for volunteer managers.
Yeah, and I get that, and I understand that from absolutely from lived experience. So what I like about your question, Jennifer, is it's almost like you've answered it in how you started it, because it's about how you start the conversation, how you even start the conversation. And so there is something about recognizing that some of this takes time, and it might be through conversations that you start this work. So there is something for me about there will always be some natural partners and advocates of volunteering, ideally both. So sometimes there are people that you need to work in partnership with, but they're not yet advocates. And then sometimes there are people who are advocates that you can't necessarily see how you work in partnership. So I would always start with just trying to work out where are my natural kind of allies and supporters or advocates here, and thinking about how I might work better with them. And thinking about what are the conversations, the broad conversations I might have with them to understand together a bit more about what's the organisational system that I'm operating in, and how is that influencing volunteering. And I wouldn't necessarily send a meeting invite that says, I want to have a conversation with you about what's the organisational operating system I'm in and how it impacts volunteering, but just starting one by one. I also have found in my experience that organisations like to know what's happening in their peer organisations or competitor organisations, and the value of being able to bring in experiences from other organisations and say, look, these people did this and it's had this impact, has been incredibly powerful. So for me, that's another set of partnerships. That's another set of kind of who are my advocates and allies, because they might be outside of your organisation. And that's where something like AVM is also really helpful, right? Because it gives you those networks to ask your peers, what have you done about this? What happened when you did this? Can you give us examples of success when you did this? So partnership conversations, ally and advocate conversations internally, but also externally, is probably where I would start.
I think it's really interesting. We this afternoon we're going to be talking with Gethin about the digital volunteer toolkit, and Matt's alluded to one of his big challenges, particularly at an organisational level, is IT and infrastructure, if you will. And I would ask you, Helen, do you think there is particular from your experience, particular parts of organisations that volunteer managers do struggle to sort of exert some kind of influence and some kind of impact? Is there a particular pattern you see with the organisations that you've engaged with?
I guess the systems thing. There's so much to say about systems. My sense is that lots of supporter-based organisations or volunteer-involving organisations, charities, which is, I know it's not exclusively charities, but often charities are still quite some way behind on their digital and data-led journey, right? That kind of, insight and data-led integrated approach to the management of a supporter journey is still rare in organisations. I think organisations have a better sense of that's what they need to get to, but are still quite a long way behind that. So generally, system support for supporters is not where most organisations would want it to be. And then if you layer over that, volunteering, and volunteers are often not seen as the most important of all of the different supporter groups. It's like a double whammy. So like system stuff is kind of behind where it needs to be, and volunteering is often at the bottom of the pile because of organisational understanding around the potential impact that volunteering can make. So it feels like a double kind of mountain to climb, or it can feel like a double mountain to climb, to influence investment in systems around volunteering.
It's that being involved in the investment discussion at the start, as opposed to being brought in much further down when that investment's already made and it's sort of being done to you rather than with you, maybe.
Yeah, and I think there is then also, we are sometimes our own worst enemies as leaders and managers and volunteers, in that we want a system to be a moon on the stick. Like I'm a big advocate for systems being like good enough. So like let's just, like, we can all make our wish list of what a blooming platinum level system will do for us in volunteering, where we want it to make the volunteers sandwiches as well as like just tell us who they are. There's something between a system that tells us who we've got and it making their sandwiches that is more pragmatic and proportionate. And so I'm a big fan of what is pragmatic and proportionate in an organisation. So that might mean that as volunteer leaders and managers, we have to scale back our initial asks and expectations of how complex a system might be for us. And we work really hard in partnership with our volunteers and our frontline volunteer managers and leaders to work out what the absolute must-haves are. So when I was in the National Trust and we did the work to commission the investment in a system to hold our volunteer management data, so literally to take it from lever arch files of folders in 250 locations, or dodgy Excel spreadsheets in breach of God knows how much GDPR legislation, and to have one system, we spent a long time being really rigorous around, there's all these nice to haves that it could do, but these are the 4 things we're going to focus on it doing in the first phase, and then worked really hard to build an evidence base of the organisational impact that having a system would have, which was not about this will make life better for volunteers or volunteer managers. It was about the organisational impact, that more systemic change that could be affected by investing in that system.
I've just made a note to Rolf and Steve to add that onto our roadmap, making sandwiches for volunteers. That's the next development we're going to see in Team Kinetic. Yeah. Watch this space. In terms of some of the examples we had of people and problems they currently face, a really interesting one was from Janice from Healthcare Improvement Scotland, where she's obviously operating in a very large organisational system with sort of the Department of Health in Scotland, and having an awful lot of questions asked about how volunteers can help relieve winter pressures. And as you can imagine, there's an awful lot there out of her control. So I guess the question I'm asking is, what the practical advice you would give to somebody who needs to go and make that system-wide argument? How do they go and make those allies, find those allies? Is there anything particularly useful you've seen that works in terms of building those bridges with different parts of the organisation to try and influence the change you'd like to see?
Well, I guess it goes back to my thing about curiosity and humility and a willingness and ability to work in partnership, right? So we're real specialists in our field. We know our volunteering world inside out, right? And that is a real strength. And we could shut up about that sometimes and listen more. So we could listen more to what's going on in other parts of the organisation. We could listen more to what other dilemmas our colleagues and peers are facing. And we could quietly be thinking about, how is that the same or different to us? What's the natural kind of relationship we could build here? Or how can I work in volunteering to help them with that problem? We could be more curious ourselves of other parts of the organisation and listen more at a kind of individual level and also an organisational level, and have some humility about that too. So sometimes volunteering isn't the most important thing for an organisation to work on, and we just have to suck that up. And it can be really frustrating because it can feel like we're never going to get to the time when volunteering is the most important thing for our organisation to work on. But sometimes it isn't. And by positioning ourselves as people who understand and recognise that and can get behind bigger picture strategic issues, I think we build our credibility, and then people want to listen to us more, because we're not the person who just turns up all the time and drones on about the detail of volunteering. We're not a kind of one-trick pony. We are organisational influencers and leaders and partners ourselves. So it's almost like we have to role model what we want other people to be. We want people to get on board with volunteering with us. So then we have to get on board with other people's stuff too, right? So there is something for me about the tone that we take to it. And if I'm really honest, I think sometimes, really honest, glasses come off for really honest, I think there is something about, I think we can do a bit like woe is us in volunteering. No one has it quite as badly as we do in volunteering. We're the most under-resourced and the hardest working, and no one understands us, and we're very different to everything else. I still see that a lot, and that doesn't make people want to work with. It's not true, and it doesn't make
familiar.
We want to be magnetic to people, not something that pushes people away.
I mean, what you've finished with there kind of alludes to, we're sort of coming to the end of the questions, but alludes to maybe one of Jeff's questions that he's finished with it. And it's less of an organisational sort of behaviour question, this one, and more, there is a national decline in volunteering numbers. And there is, obviously, sort of in the context of what we said, there's so much volunteer managers can do. What can volunteer managers do within their organisation to try and help with that recruitment, try and drive numbers back to maybe where we were used to pre-pandemic? Because obviously there's only so much you can do as an individual volunteer manager, but maybe volunteer managers working organisationally, there may be more we can achieve. Have you got any thoughts about how we might be able to reverse that trend as volunteer managers within our organisations?
Yeah, and I think it's really, I just want to pause and notice the difference between how Jeff has written the question and how you've articulated it, Chris.
Yeah.
So because Jeff has written the question, right, is it like, let's give that problem to volunteer man. I know that's not the intention, Jeff, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But give that problem to volunteer managers to solve. And what you've really neatly and nicely done, Chris, is said, what's the role volunteer managers can play? But what can organisations do? Because this is an organisational piece, and actually, you know, it's a sector-wide piece and a societal thing, isn't it? But it isn't for volunteer managers to solve it, because it goes back to those old-fashioned arguments where people would go to volunteer leaders and say, I need 20 more people, and you know, the jokes we used to say about, we store those 20 extra volunteers in our filing cabinet, we'll just open that and get them out for you now, like that stuff. So it isn't for volunteer managers to solve that problem. I do think there's something about how we get better at leading with the quality of the experience that someone will have if they choose to spend time with our organisation in whatever way they want to support it. What's the benefit they get from that? And being really clear about that. And there is loads of research and evidence that tells us about changes we might need to make to how we organise and structure volunteering, which volunteer managers and leaders themselves can't affect. So the evidence, you know, things that like are in time well spent around, people want more flexibility, or they think volunteering is going to be too much like a paid job, or actually the fear of being, particularly if we think about the diversity of volunteers, the fear of being out of pocket is, all of these things are barriers to people getting involved. Volunteer managers often can't solve those things by themselves, but working in partnership with others in the organisation to think about how can we create more flexible opportunities? How can we ensure this doesn't feel like paid work? How can we really make sure that people are not out of pocket, not just say it, but actually they are out of pocket for 3 months while there's a delay in their expenses being paid back? Those are things that we know and we cannot solve by ourselves as volunteer leaders and managers.
No, I agree, and they are definite system problems rather than, like you say, volunteer management problems. We've got one last question from Sarah. Well, it's more of a statement, but it's always a controversialist one. I find not calling it volunteering initially and just helping out with activity gets people involved and a taste of what they can help with. And it's alluding to what you just said about flexibility. I think, yeah, I think it's that whole question of how we define what we're asking people to do. Again, organisationally and as volunteer managers is an ongoing area of debate. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that particular topic, Helen?
On what it's called, sorry.
Yeah, how we define volunteering as the act of doing it. If we actually call it volunteering, even, you know, or do we find other language to organisationally as well as volunteer managers?
I've realised that there are people in the chat who can remember when I was at the National Trust, so they may well remember being at a leadership conference where I was asked this, and I infamously said, I don't care what it's called, which sounded really dismissive, and that wasn't at all. But I'm not bothered about the label. What I'm bothered about is having labels that work for the people we're trying to attract. So if that means we have to call it loads of different things in our organisation, so be it. But we need to stop thinking about how we feel about the label and think more about, I think, as Sarah is indicating, what is the terminology or lack of a label that is most appropriate for the people we are trying to attract, not even necessarily the people we've got now, but the people we're trying to attract. So we stop putting ourselves at the front of that debate and discussion. In National Trust land, that used to be whether we would have the word volunteer on people's badges or not. I don't care. I don't care what it says on the badge. I care how the volunteer feels about that or the visitor feels about it.
I have this theory that the 20% of people that are our regular volunteers almost do it despite our best efforts. Sometimes they'll turn up no matter what, and then really it's the next 60% of people we want to be attracting. That's where there's an opportunity for growth and new volunteers and accessing new groups of people. And like you say, if the language for those guys is different to the 20% that call themselves volunteers, who really cares as long as we find out what that language is?
Yeah, but I think sometimes what we struggle with is our existing incumbent volunteer base, particularly if they've been really long serving, do have views about it.
Yes.
And we sometimes allow the disproportionately strongly held and loudly articulated views of our incumbents to get in the way of evolving our practice in a way that might enable us to attract new volunteers.
I think we're about there with the questions. All that's left for me to say, Helen, is a massive thank you for your sharing your experience and your knowledge. We will be sharing as many links as possible from what Helen mentioned in her slides, and the slides will be available as I mentioned. Helen, a massive thank you. Really interesting, really challenging. Thanks a lot.
It is my absolute pleasure. I'm going to hang around for a bit. That's all right. I'm allowed, right?
Oh, we'd love to have you.